Welcome to the first video on Kate Summerscale's 2016 The Wicked Boy, a part of the Greenwich Detective Fiction series originally composed for the third-year core course in English literature at the University of Greenwich, but since it's on YouTube, it's open to everyone. In this video, we'll be placing The Wicked Boy in relation to the first of two literary strands, two literary traditions, if you like, true crime texts. A subsequent video will think through how the Wicked Boy can be related to a domesticated form of horrors for many students, postmodernism, and the postmodern conception of how meaning operates and what texts actually are. Notice I've used the word texts here, for one of the questions the Wicked Boy raises, as all true crime stories do, is how far it's fiction and how much it's fact. What is the Wicked Boy? And what is a wicked boy? As a student told me once, I didn't know what was going on. Was it a novel? I guessed straight away who did it. So at least this student realised who committed the murder almost immediately. What's the Wicked Boy about then? Not the uncovering of a whodunit by a detective, though there is indeed a detective in the text. He's a minor character, Detective Inspector Mellish. It's a very fictional name, that, isn't it? He's even less important to the uncovering of the crime than Detective Carter in Henry Dunbar. Certainly in the selection of texts in this series of videos, the detective police don't play central roles, and they won't surprise you that that is, of course, deliberate in my choice. While this student decided she knew who'd done it straight away, other students aren't so sure. They have strong views that who the text tells us is the murderer. And again, there are spoiler alerts here, so now's the time to stop the video if you don't want to know. Who the text tells us is the murderer didn't do it after all. He was covering for his brother, they say. These students don't like Natty. He's too good to be true. And then there's the question of what caused murder. The Wicked Boy's narrative, its form, suggests that fiction was a contributory cause. Yes, fiction itself acted on real life to cause a real murder. And it won't surprise you that that's another one of the reasons I wanted us to think about this text. Now, some students prefer to think, though, that literature has no such effects. They ignore the many literary references and allusions in The Wicked Boy, and they prefer the idea that, say, the sexual abuse of the murderer by his mother was the root of his actions. Others again think that it was just poverty and desperation. What was Robert's future? He seems a soft-hearted boy whose only future, realistically, was to be like his father, working in the terrible animal transport ships. And then what if, as others think again, Robert has realised he's gay, but knows that desires for other men are illegal? The Oscar Wilde trials had been all over the newspapers in April and May 1895, just 5 weeks or so before the murder. He's feeling desperate, and perhaps his mother's been acting like a member of the gender and sexuality police. Yet others again think that the murderer's taking revenge on his mother for having an affair while his father's away. I don't know what's going on. This ambiguity seems to be at the root of The Wicked Boy. And what seems perhaps more certain is that the main detectives in this case are firstly the narrator, Kate Summerscale, and us, the reader. Kate has done the research for us and laid it out, but even so, we're very active, as these various interpretations that I've given me by students in the past. We're very active in deciding what are the main clues, what are the important ones and what are the unimportant ones, and how we are to interpret them. This is fundamental, I think, to the various understandings of the murder. What archives do we draw on? What game do we think we're actually playing here. And then there's the question of the form of The Wicked Boy, indeed, and particularly its genre. Is The Wicked Boy a novel or something else? I have to say, I keep calling it in my head a novel. You remember that whether we saw An Unsuitable Job for a Woman as a female Bildungsroman, a novel about the formation of a young woman's character, or simply as a crime badly investigated by a woman, a crime whose investigation by her should be seen as a message passed between men and no more, affects how we can understand that novel. And what about this one? What about The Wicked Boy? Very early on, and this is really stressed, the passage you see on the screen comes right at the end of the first chapter, and it picks up quite a lengthy passage covering several pages that we've read already. In this passage that I quote on the screen, we find a description of what Robert Coombs has been reading. The sensational and violent boy's adventure fiction starring the intrepid boy, inventor and often sea-going traveller, Jack Wright. Jack Wright was the central character of about 120 short novels written mainly by Luis Sanarins, the Cuban-born American New Yorker, between just 1891 and 1896. Imagine. 5 years and 120 short novels. Ha! These Victorians. The Jack Wright stories, says the narrator of The Wicked Boy, were a kind of American imitation of Jules Verne. They were immensely popular and appeared in a variety of guises. We actually don't know how many were sold. There's no records of popular fiction like this. The version that Robert comes across comes from the American 5-cent weekly periodical The Boys Star Library, and in case you're wondering, it will have been the retailer who decided to reduce the price to 4 cents from 5 on the left-hand image. I haven't been able to reproduce the illustrated cover of the story that the narrator of The Wicked Boy describes Robert as reading, but here are the covers of 2 others that give you a good idea. The illustration that's reproduced in the photos in The Wicked Boy itself, I should say, is actually a very different kind of story issued by the Aldine Publishing Company, a London-based publisher specialising in reprints of American fiction. But so far as I know, they didn't actually issue the Jack Wright stories until the 20th century, so quite a long time after the events of The Wicked Boy. But that wouldn't have been a problem, for Robert's father could of course have brought them back for him. And of course such publications were imported into Britain in vast numbers. What the narrator of The Wicked Boy is telling us by emphasising the Jack Wright story so early on is that we should see fiction and fact not as opposed to one another, not as binary opposites, but as neighbouring entities whose boundaries are porous, perhaps like a Venn diagram where you remember those category circles or category shapes overlap rather than are on opposite sides of the page. Now, key in this passage is that little word like. Fiction and reality are analogous, not identical. Fiction is a simile, a similitude of reality. Perhaps, as we'll see, fiction is a rehearsal for it, an experiment, even a guide to reality. But who's making this claim about reality and fiction, and what's the point of it? Doesn't it just muddy the waters and confuse us? Perhaps, given that the text is pretty clear about who done it, the question of how text influences us is one of the mysteries that The Wicked Boy is exploring. But if that's the case, what's then the real crime that's being explored? We saw that it's quite possible to read An Unsuitable Job for a Woman not only about who murdered Mark and why, but also about what women have to do to survive in a man's world, basically become criminal. We can read it either as a denunciation of that situation as I do, or as a conservative endorsement of patriarchal power, that women who resist mess up detection to such an extent that they become criminal. That's certainly a possible reading. It's not one I particularly like. Similarly here, a related question seems to me to be crucial. The text tells us very early on who committed the murder, Robert, but we don't really know why. The murder is a fact. It's reality. But it's in discussion of the motive, in the discussion of the murderer's mental life, that fiction seems most pertinent. And we see that in this passage. Now, given the importance that the text attributes to fiction in corporeal, physical, not just mental life, how can we relate this to our archive? How can we fit it into our timeline? Well, as you can see from this updated version of a by now very familiar timeline, there are over 40 years between P.D. James's An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. We're 2 generations on from hard-boiled detective fiction, and over 100 years, more than 3 generations from the beginnings of the Golden Age, and another one before that to Sherlock Holmes. Off the screen, we may be 7 or 8 generations away from Edgar Allan Poe. Now, the gap between An Unsuitable Job and the Kate Summerscale I'll address in a subsequent video. But I want now to direct your attention to a new kind of detective. Kate Summerscale, narrator. Not police, not professional, not consultant, not amateur, but the detective as narrator. Now, Philip Marlowe had been our previous example of detective narrator, but this is different because whereas Raymond Chandler had been the author behind the narrator, Philip Marlowe, in this case, Kate Summerscale is also the name of the author. The author is, of course, a person who exists in physical, corporeal reality. At least that's the convention. We won't go on to explore that. The author exists in the real world, in our world. The identity of the names of narrator and author therefore seem to lend the narrative an air of truth. Maybe then we need a different timeline that's based not just on the nature of the detective, but on true crime stories. Yes, perhaps it's here, under the heading True Crime, that we can better place Kate Summerscale's work rather than in the tradition of detective fiction, of fictional detectives, entirely fictional detectives. Here, the author herself is, of course, the detective. The tradition of true crime stories is very old. As we saw in the first video on Sherlock Holmes, it's quite possible to trace stories of crime and detection back to the ancient world. Dorothy Sayers, in an influential introduction to a collection she edited in 1928 called Great Short Stories of Detection, Mystery and Horror, Dorothy Sayers saw traces in the Bible and in Greek myth as well as literature. And more recent transnational research has told us about Gong An, a popular kind of story in China about magistrates who solved criminal cases. And these stories date certainly to the 13th century, and they're probably even earlier. And they may very well be regarded as true crime stories. But as for understanding the ancestry of the Wicked Boy, perhaps it's more helpful to think of the criminal biographies that were popular in the 18th century. In London, criminals to be executed were kept at Newgate Prison, hence my use in this series of lectures from time to time of this Newgate clock. But rather more important for literary and cultural history was the publication of the Newgate Calendar in 1773, a collection of lives of great criminals. It was by no means the first criminal biography or collection of criminals, as you can see, criminal lives rather. Of course, Daniel Defoe, not on the screen, had also written criminal biographies too, but the Newgate Calendar
was the one that was a huge source of fiction dealing with criminals from then on, and which lent a particular name to a subgenre. Oliver Twist, for example, is an avatar of what was called nougat fiction. Here's part of the title page of the second edition of one of the most famous 18th century collections of criminal biographies. This one, the lives and adventures of the most famous highwaymen, murderers, street robbers, etc., was printed in 1742. Now, when we say popular, we don't only mean available to all and mass produced. Look, you can see this one is adorned with 20 curious copper plates, that is, illustrations. This was an expensive form of printing, and in fact the declared sales price for this volume was the huge sum of 15 shillings. Now this kind of volume was intended for the gentleman's diversion, not the farm labourer, street sweeper or kitchen maid. It was certainly not kitchen literature of the kind of the cheap magazine which Mary Braddon published the first version of Henry Dunbar in. This was the expensive deluxe version of cheap things like this. If what we've just seen was printed in large numbers for the elite, the really popular in the sense of available to a lot of people and printed in large numbers, we need to turn to things like this: execution broadsides. And as you know, executions were great spectacles attended by hundreds, if not thousands of people. This execution broadside claims an audience of 6,000 to 7,000 persons, men as well as women. In fact, here, the majority of them, says the broadside, were women. And as you can see here, the illustration sets up the execution with a backdrop as if in front of a screen to make the hanging stand out from the buildings behind it. But why was the person or people being hanged? The execution broadside was there to tell you. They were very cheap and on sale during the spectacle of execution. Think of them as kinds of ghoulish theatre programmes or football memorabilia, souvenirs of spectacles that you can show your neighbours or your grandchildren and prove that you were there. Horrendous. Broadsides often claimed to be the dying confessions of the criminals. And of course, a lot of these were made up. Even when there's a pretty bare account of the crimes, as in fact on this particular broadside, we find a little poetic reflection at the end, urging us to reflect on what awaits the criminal, the results of whose fall, from high standards, from the gallows, down to hell, here called the fiery coast, is pretty clear. It's all very metaphorical and self-reflexive. Something that's picked up in Henry Dunbar, of course, though to different and anti-death penalty purposes. We find the idea that the criminal soul must be racked with guilt even before it goes to hell. Here, the moral is delivered in a letter supposedly written by the criminal himself. When you think of my fate, may check any growing evil on your part. Now, two things. Yes, that's the same illustration of a hanging on two different broadsides for different executions. This one for James Pratt and John Smith. It's the same as the one for the previous broadside you saw on George Cropper and Thomas Turner. The illustrations aren't supposed to be realistic. They rather alert the potential customer to what kind of thing they're buying. Second, and most important, the account of the criminal is supposed to teach the reader a lesson. Yes, again, as we saw with The Wicked Boy, the end of the first chapter, literature is considered to influence our lives. Now, keep that in mind, for although you may think it's silly and simple, it's actually a complex point that we shall return to in subsequent videos. Here it's very clear, and as critics like John Skaggs and Stephen Knight remind us, these crime stories are meant as cautionary tales, or at least they're sold as cautionary tales, in which a criminal is captured, tried and punished, And this was intended as a way of maintaining patriarchal social order. These aren't yet detection stories, for the criminals are caught through the operation of divine providence, divine justice. But they do, to various degrees of detail, trace the lives of criminals. And that's the important thing. To return to our timeline, it won't perhaps surprise you to see the name of Henry Fielding there as an author of criminal biography. By the way, perhaps I should say that Jonathan Wild, in The History of the Life of the Late Mr. Jonathan Wild the Great, Jonathan Wild for years managed to stay on both sides of the law, enriching himself through criminal means while also operating as informer and thief taker. As I said in the first video in Henry Dunbar, in the first outline of the history of detective fiction that we saw, Henry Fielding was not only a novelist but a magistrate who founded the Bow Street Runners, predecessors of the modern police. And in the history of the life of the late Jonathan Wild the Great, he's obviously combining the two sides of his life and making a profit out of it. Well, after the various criminal lives of the 18th century, the next major development comprised the ghost-written memoirs by the first head of the French police, the Sûreté, again, that you've heard about in the first timeline. This was Vidocq, which, as we saw in that first version, I said was very influential on Edgar Allan Poe. These memoirs of what's supposed really to happen. Now, I've mentioned the Metropolitan Police Act there as well, because that is the formation of the modern police in Britain. But look, I've mentioned Poe, but it's not the Murders in the Rue Morgue that I've listed here, but Poe's second Dupin story, The Mysteries of Marie Roget, that published in 1842. Set like The Murders in Paris, this was actually based on a real case, the murder of Mary Rogers in New York in 1841. Well, you can hear what Poe has actually done. He's just Frenchified Mary Rogers as Marie Roget and stuck her in Paris. Poe used the evidence of the trial in New York, which was extensively reported in the press there. And Dupin solves the Parisian version of the murder, in fact, purely from reading newspapers. This story really does star a detective reader. What we do see is a very, very close relationship here in this second Dupin story between journalism and fiction. And it's this relationship in varied configurations, depending on how you define journalist, not least, that's key to the whole true crime genre. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to get bogged down by filling in this timeline in anything like the detail of the main one. In fact, I only want to add one more item before we return to Kate Summerscale, and that is In Cold Blood by the author of Breakfast at Tiffany's, which I'm sure you know, Truman Capote. I will be discussing this at some length though, so bear with me. In Cold Blood came out originally in the New Yorker magazine in September and October of 1965, before appearing in volume form in January 1966. Now, in volume form, it's apparently the second best-selling true crime book of all time. And it's based on the shooting of a family in rural Kansas on the 15th of November 1959. The two men who'd killed the family were hanged earlier in 1965. I don't mean to say that this proximity had anything to do with the publication. Oh, go on, maybe it did. With In Cold Blood, Capote claimed that he'd invented a new genre, the non-fiction novel. The acknowledgements begin by claiming that all the material in this book not derived from my own observation is either taken from official records or is the result of interviews with the persons directly concerned, more often than not, considerable interviews conducted over a considerable period of time. Oh, in other words, this book took a lot of work. And this work, this research, lays claim to factual accuracy and hence to being regarded as journalism. But what kind of journalism are we talking about here? Not all journalism is truthful as accurate as in 2020 we know all too well. A lot of it is very emotional. When we think of standard, serious journalism that refers to reality, perhaps we think of this kind of thing, what the American author Tom Wolfe called beige journalism. It's well constructed according to a pattern that was established by the managing editor of the New York Times early in the 20th century. It's unemotional, factual, clear, concerned to communicate what really happened, the truth in the material world. It wants to communicate to its readers in as efficient and responsible a way as possible. Perhaps think of our idea of what the BBC should be in its ideal form. But that's not what Truman Capote was interested. Do you think something quite cold, organised with a lead, a body of text and a kicker at the end, a little unexpected twist at the end, would that really have turned quite a long text into the second bestseller of true crime fiction of all? I think not. In 1973, Truman Capote was grouped by the journalist and author, Tom Wolfe again, as a new journalist, along with himself and quite a few other names you might have heard of, Hunter S. Thompson, Norman Mailer, Joan Didion and others. And in this defining and incredibly important anthology, you can see that extracts from In Cold Blood are included as an example of this new journalism. What was characteristic of the new journalism and the new journalists was that they all published not in boring beige newspapers, but in cool new magazines like The New Yorker, Esquire, Rolling Stone, and you probably know this iconic cover of a naked John Lennon embracing Yoko Ono. This is cool stuff. This is up to date. This is modern. This is the way things are now. Well, for the 1960s. The new journalists, in fact, themselves became celebrities in their own rights, like rock stars they sometimes covered. They were on the covers of the magazines they wrote for. There are 3 Esquire covers here from the late 1970s. And of course, they made huge amount of money, these journalists. But what did they do that was so different from Carl Van Anders journalism? What was new? Here's the blurb from the first edition of Tom Wolfe's 1973 New Journalism Anthology. It's quite typical new journalism hyperbole, claiming that the new journalism has all but supplanted the novel as the most revered, prestigious and powerful literary form. Wow. It won't surprise you that new journalism very early on received a lot of criticism. Now, I love this quotation from an early attack on it. In that upholder of high culture, the New York Review of Books, the new journalism, or para-journalism, as the author called it, was a bastard form that exploits the factual authority of journalism and the atmospheric license of fiction just for entertainment's sake. Of course, the author, Dwight MacDonald, was correct in many ways, just as Mansell's attack on sensation fiction in the 1860s was correct in many ways too. Just because we disagree with the overall point of view doesn't mean to say we can't appreciate the details or the specific elements of the critique. MacDonald, for example, is spot on in identifying the social network, the precise form of almost exclusively masculine social capital that underlay new journalism and its promotion, and how at the root was a desire to maximize financial capital, to write and publish for money, in other words. Many of the new journalists practicing what I shall reframe not as bastard form of journalism, but as a hybrid form of journalism and fiction. Many of these new journalists became very rich indeed, and it certainly benefited the entertainment industry as a whole. Tom Wolfe made over $60 million over his career and left 20 million of it on his death. Truman Capote, though, bless him, only left 10 million when he died. Yes, indeed. In new journalism, money had a huge role in regulating what they chose to write and how. When The Guardian came to reflect on In Cold Blood, over 50 years after its publication, it noted the millions sold and its transnational appeal, as well as the 3 films, one made just a year after the volume form edition had come out in 1966, and 2 more on its double 50th anniversary, as a serial story in a magazine in the autumn of 1965, and as the novel in, or is it a novel? The non-fiction novel in 1966. And you can really appreciate why it might have spawned a huge number of imitations. Indeed, In Cold Blood and its hybrid new journalistic brothers marked a huge turn to true crime, which has never looked back. Even more than the Newgate calendar, the new journalism, and especially In Cold Blood, has had a huge effect on literature and publishing, on the whole fiction of detection, the whole fiction of crime. Key, obviously, is proximity. If before proximity had been veiled, it's still been important. It's this fantasy of proximity that we seem to want. Whether it's visiting the supposed house in Baker Street where Sherlock Holmes was supposed to live, or working out where Cordelia Gray lives in her bedsit near the Imperial War Museum, or what the Treloar Building really is in Los Angeles, or the route that Inspector Ganimard took when following the mysterious man with the orange peel at the opening of the Red Silk Scarf, or the confusing murder where the murdered woman and the accused murderer shared the same name, the murder from 1862 that resonates with Henry Dunbar so powerfully, or the royal scandals that resonated with a scandal in Bohemia. But here, in true crime in The Wicked Boy, we don't need the indirectness, the suggestions, the veils of proximity and personality. We aren't talking of a novel like a locked box, whose key we need to reveal its secrets inside. True crime tackles proximity head on. It tries to get as close as possible to the subject of its investigations, almost always the criminal, by the way, not the victim. The implications of that we can talk about later. But to list the facts of the crime just isn't enough. Even the execution broadside knew that. True crime is an intensification to the maximum possible of proximity. Even if, to effect that intensification, the work needs artfully to rearrange, maybe even alter reality a bit, fib a bit, like the broadside illustrations that turn the hangings in front of buildings into, well, what we will see as projections onto a screen in a cinema. And it does that just so that we, readers, can be sure to see the hangings. True crime takes us beyond any idea of resonance or even of a carefully constructed factual newspaper report. It seeks to take us inside the head of the criminal. The mystery is not what or where or when or how. It's why. What is the motive for the murder? And as we heard at the beginning of this video, The Wicked Boy certainly generates a lot of very varied answers to that, despite its length, despite the amount of detail we're given. So now we can see The Wicked Boy as a true crime text, playing a specific variant of the game of detection. It's a descendant of the broadside and of the 1960s and 1970s new journalism. But that doesn't really answer the question of why The Wicked Boy should stress so early and so much the role of fiction, quite as much as we've seen that it does. For The Wicked Boy seems to me to ask to be read not just as a true crime story, but as an intensely self-conscious, you guessed it, postmodern true crime story. But to think through the implications of that will require another video.